All right, so I'm going to go over how you can set up a Fleshy eye rig for a character. And as you can see, I have already created the eyelid joints. I have painted the weights of the geometry to the eyelids. And as you can see, I have set up two custom attributes for controlling the upper and lower eyelid joints. And they are connected to these two joints. So if I animate these two custom attributes, you can see that the eyelids are actually opening and closing. So if I go through the timeline, you can see that the eyelids are opening and closing, right? Nothing fancy. It's just painting the weights of the vertices here and the geometry to these upper lids and lower lids joints. Now it's time to set up the fleshy eye. So again, the concept of fleshy eyes is that we want to have some interaction between the eyeballs and the eyelids. So when I move the controllers or when I rotate the eyeballs, I want to have the eyelids to somehow interact with this movement. So they don't look that much CG because we want to have this connection between the eyelid and the eyeballs. So the whole concept is that you want to rotate these eyelid joints based on the movement of the eyeball joint, right? If you somehow can transfer this movement that is coming from the eyeballs to control these two joints that are taking care of the eyelids, you're all done. I mean, it's just that easy. So you might say that we can just make a connection that goes from the rotation values or rotation attributes of this eyeball joint to control these two eyelid joints, right? You might say that, but the only problem is that we already have some input connections on the rotation values of these two joints for opening and closing the eyelids. So if I want to make a connection coming from the eyeball joint to these two joints, I'm not able to do that because I'm already having this input connection. All right. So I will create another extra joint on top of these two eyelid joints. I will parent these two eyelid joints to those extra joints. I will control those extra joints using whatever I want to do. And yet I'm having this input connection on these two eyelid joints. Okay. So the process is just creating one extra joint for each one of these and then create the whole setup. So as you can see, I'm having one joint, a pair of two joints for each eyelid. One of them is just the tip of the hierarchy. I don't want to see those. So these are the two joints, the two base joints. And as you can see, again, I'm having this input connection that is coming from these two attributes that control the open and closeness of these two eyelids, right? So now I can simply just duplicate each one of these joints, get rid of this extra joint that it will give me, all right? So I ended up having one joint that is sitting on top of this lower joint, all right? I can rename it to fleshy lower lid, maybe lower lid fleshy joint. Okay. Same as the other one. Right upper lid fleshy joint. Okay. I will not do anything in terms of their attributes. They should be the same as the one that you are having here on the base joints. Okay. I will not freeze the transformation. I will not do anything. Now I will parent these joints to these extra joints. So right lower lid base joint, it will be a child of right lower lid fleshy joint. Simply parent them. Do the same thing for this one. So I will end up having three joints here. Again, if I go one by one, I'm having this lower lid fleshy joint, then the lower lid base joint, which is receiving that input connection for closing and opening that, and this tip joint. All right. So now I'm having an extra joint that can receive some order from some other attribute. So for example, if I rotate it, you can see that even though this base joint is having this input connection, yet I'm having an extra level of control over the rotation and movement, for example, of this joint too. Okay. So now it's time to connect the rotation of these two extra joints, these two extra joints, to the rotation of this eyeball joint. Okay? If I simply make a straight connection from this eyeball joint to these two extra joints, I will get the functionality here. But I know that I don't want to have that much of influence coming from the eyeballs to the eyelids. I want to just lower that by 50% or something like that. If I make a straight connection, the whole movement or the whole rotation coming from the eyeball joints will transfer to the eyelids. And I don't want to see that. I don't want to have full influence on that. So instead of making a straight connection from these rotations to these ones, I will go to the node editor, divide it by 2 or 3, divide the rotation of the eyeball joint by 2 or 3, and then plug it into the eyelids. Okay? So Windows, node editor, I will load the joint for the eyeball into the node editor by middle mouse click and dragging the eye joint here. Oops. Or adding that to the node editor by clicking on this button. Alright. Then I will load these two extra joints that I have just created into the node editor. Alright. Then I'm going to divide the value of the rotation of these joints by 2 or 3. So I'm going to create a multiply divide node. Multiply divide node. I'm going to connect the rotation attribute of the eyeball joint to the first input of this multiply divide node. So rotation goes to the input 1. Okay. Then I will select the multiply divide node, go to the attribute editor, and make sure that the operation is set to divide. Okay, and divide it by 2. You can always change this attribute. So for now, let's divide it by 2. Now I'm gonna plug in the output of this multiply divide node to the rotation values of these two joints. Okay, let's start with the upper joint. I'm gonna connect the output to the rotation value of this joint. Okay, now let's test it. If I move or rotate the eyeball, you can see that the upper eyelid is also following that rotation with a half influence, right? Because we divided it by 2. Okay. You should do the same thing for the lower lid. However, I guess we have to inverse it somehow. Let's test it. Node editor again. This is the lower lid. Let's see if we just connect that straightly coming from this multiply divide node. What happens? Output, rotation to rotation. I'm guessing that some of the axis should be reversed. Apparently not. Yeah, it's working. Let's go up and down. Up and down is working. Left and right is working. So I think we are all set. If you want to have more influence coming from the eyeball, you can always go to the multiply divide node and divide it by a value of less than that. So for example, 1.5. You are saying that I want to have more influence coming from the eyeball, right? So now if I move this, you can see that the eyelids are actually having more influence from the eyeball. If you want to have less influence, you can always change it. So divide it by 3, for example. Okay. Still working, but it's now having less influence. If you want to give the animator the opportunity to change this value, you can always add 3 custom attributes here, or just 1 custom attribute here on this controller, and plug it into this these 3 attributes here. So always the animator is able to change this value later on. Okay, so it's totally up to you. But that's the whole concept of creating the fleshy eye. Now you can see that for each eyelid we are having 3 joints. If we ignore the tip joint, we are having one for the base, one for the fleshy. The base is receiving the connection for the open and closing eyelids, and the fleshy joint is receiving 3 connections coming from the eyeball itself. Okay? Does it make sense? Any question? No? All right.